So motherhood to me means the annihilation of self in many respects, and at the same time, becoming a version of myself that feels more me.
Welcome to the Higher Love with Megan podcast with me, your host, Megan Cooper, a holistic coach and trauma-informed practitioner. This podcast seeks to break out of the echo chamber of societal narratives that perpetuate our institutions and challenge the status quo of wellness and beyond. Join me as we decolonize our minds, address and use our privilege, and prioritize inclusivity. Here, diverse experiences are honoured, and together we are fostering a space that stands for higher love for all. As a listener, you are not just here to passively consume. You're an ambassador for deep healing and societal evolutions, ready to engage in thought-provoking, challenging conversations. As your host, I'm committed to providing ever-expansive spaces that inspire us to contribute to a world defined by higher love. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Up on the Higher Love with Megan podcast this week, we have Jacqueline Kelly. Jacqueline is a life coach for mums who feel like they've lost sight of themselves in motherhood. She helps them get very clear and confident about who they are now at this stage of their motherhood journey. Jacqueline has spent years challenging the unrealistic standards of motherhood that we are encouraged to aspire to, and in doing this has redefined what's possible not just for her, but for the mothers that she works with. So I would love to just kind of start with this question of what motherhood means to you today.
I think, first of all, that's a great question. And that distinction or that caveat that you added at the end is huge, actually. I suppose to give context to what I'm about to say. So motherhood definitely means something very different to me today than it did 10 and a half years ago when my son was born. And also my understanding of what motherhood means has completely changed. And I'm actually at a point in my life where my own studies, I'm training to be a psychotherapist, and I go into my final year in October. So I'm looking at the topic of my thesis, the piece of research that I'll undertake, and it's all about identity. Who have I become? And I think that can't be separated from what motherhood means to me. Like, who have I become? Who am I in my motherhood? And now what motherhood means to me is it is a complete and utter transformation of the concept, the understanding, and the relationship to and with self. So all of who I thought I was, all who I had been, has been completely impacted and shattered. And I say shattered as in not broken, but it's like my sense of self imploded as a result of motherhood. And there are times when I can't quite believe who I have become as a result of these two little beings that I'm responsible for a while. So motherhood to me means the annihilation of self in many respects, and at the same time, becoming a version of myself that feels more me than any other version of myself that existed beforehand.
I'd love to delve into all of that, all of those aspects. And, you know, what you're speaking to, I know is matrescence. And I had no idea what matrescence was. I'd never heard of it, which I found unbelievable, really, that as a woman of, you know, childbearing age, let's say that I had no idea what that was, that it hadn't come into my sphere. So how did you come across matrescence after having your children, and what did it mean to you when you did?
Completely changed my life. And also, I'm with you on the not knowing such a word existed. So my first child was born in 2013. I never heard or came across the word matrescence until 2018. So I've been in my motherhood over 5 years, but the point at which this term makes its way to me. And it was only as a result of a woman sharing, a mother that I worked with, sharing with me a TED talk done by Dr. Alexandra Sachs, which, if you know the word, I'm sure by this stage you've seen that. It went viral. It was like a 6.5 minute TED talk. And I watched it over and over and over again, because in that 6.5 minutes, it soothed me, destroyed me, and broke my heart and fixed it in ways that I hadn't been able to do yet. And I had been grappling with so much of what she spoke about, this transition into motherhood, all of that. I couldn't understand it. And I felt at the time, like the 5 years that it took me to get to that word, by that point, I had already undergone several identity crises. I had become a life coach because I was so hungry to connect and speak with other mothers who were speaking the same way that I spoke about motherhood, which is, I feel so lost. I don't know who I am anymore. I feel like society doesn't understand me, and they're being very quick to be labelled postnatally depressed. But everything that I know about postnatal depression, it doesn't sit with me. I don't believe that I'm mentally unwell. I don't believe there's a chemical imbalance in my brain that is making me feel like this, which the medical model at that particular time, that's 11 years ago, that those were my only discussions around that topic. And so the point at which I came across this term matrescence, it was like this understanding. It just opened up the whole new world of study, of language, of people who understood what, or who attempted to understand and explain what happens to a woman, to a person when they become a mother. And it was incredible.
And just to define the word matrescence, can you just kind of give a definition for somebody who is completely new to this and hearing this literally for the first time, just for this context?
Yeah, I suppose I don't think we can ever have a conversation about the word without acknowledging where it comes from. So there was a woman, Dana Raphael, who was an anthropologist, was studying cultures and societies. And at that particular time, I'm talking like maybe the 70s perhaps, or 60s. I'm not entirely sure about exactly when, but at that time in her studies, my understanding of what has been written about this is that the emphasis was being placed on a woman becoming a wife as one of the biggest rites of passage. But in her observations, Dana Raphael was observing the fact that motherhood seems to be going unobserved and undocumented. And in actual fact, becoming a mother would be a huge rite of passage, not just the rite of passage, but a huge rite of passage for those who choose to go down that route. So this is where she coined the term matrescence, to acknowledge this particular, it's the time of mother becoming, is what it means. So Dana Raphael, in her academic studies, noted this. The term kind of gets buried within academic literature, and we fast forward many years later, in comes the work of a woman called Dr. Aurelia Athen, who is a clinical psychologist who was specialising in seeing mothers in her private practice. Mothers were coming in time and time again with the same similar challenges, but there was no framework, there was no body of work for these mothers to be able to use as a reference to help them understand their experience. Dr. Athen and her students went digging around in academia, in the literature, to try and find, like, there must be something we can use here. There has to be an acknowledgement. Came across the word matrescence by Dana Raphael, and then was able to say, okay, well, this actually potentially provides a framework for all mothers to understand. It gives us a word, it gives us an idea, it gives us a way to understand that there is a name that can be applied to transitioning into motherhood. And what I love about Dr. Athen's work is that she talks about, you know, it's not, matrescence isn't limited to a woman biologically carrying a child and giving birth. You know, the experience of becoming a mother is open to everybody who goes into that experience. And she also talks about that arguably it lasts a lifetime, which to me makes perfect sense, because my son will be 11 in October, and I've never been a mother of an 11-year-old before. So of course, my own experience, my own transitioning into the type of mother I am today is constantly evolving. And then I think, if my understanding is correct, Dr. Athen with her students were discussing, the word matrescence, how can it be applied? How can we make it easily understood to everybody? And I think it was one of her students that was referenced, it's like adolescence, basically. And so now in Dr. Alexandra Sachs' TED Talk, that's what was discussed. If we were to consider matrescence, the time of mother becoming, the transition into motherhood, the same way that we consider what it's like for our children to become teenagers and they transition into adolescence. So when we consider the incredibly huge impact or effect on our hormones, physiological states or psychological states or spiritual states, how society sees us, it suddenly gives us a whole different lens to look at the experience of a mother through, because when we consider the impact in all of those areas in her life, we can begin to see motherhood is not just one of many things that we'll do in a lifetime. And in fact, it's an incredible identity shift. And if we were to be able to hold that and approach and speak with and converse with our mothers, it would be a very different relationship, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. And something that I was really hearing was this sense of it's not just the rite of passage when you have a baby. It's a continual rite of passage because, you're
Yes.
a mother to a baby, you're a mother to a toddler, you're a mother to a, 7, 8-year-old, an 11-year-old, 15-year-old. I mean, my mother's learning how to be a mother to a 35-year-old woman,
Yes.
So it's this continual rite of passage, I guess, that there's no kind of roadmap or instruction manual for, but you're learning on the job every single day, but this continual unfolding of self and the relationship that you have with your child and yourself within that. I was curious in how you see I'm going to try and say this word, pathologization of motherhood. I'm was really interested to ask you that.
This is a big interest of mine. And again, it speaks to my own, everything that I speak about and talk about. And a lot of the time, the mothers that I work with, they are a version of myself and they are grappling with issues that perhaps I grappled with further back in my experience. In my second year of my studies, this master's degree, we studied a module on the psychopathology. And in that, so that was, I think, 22 into 23. And by that point, I had been a mother for almost 10 years. To all of a sudden be confronted with a language and understanding that unlocks part of my own motherhood experience was tremendously emotional and difficult. And it was at that, only then did I consider I was postnatally depressed. However, how postnatal depression is defined and the lens in which it is viewed through and diagnosed is very different. So the pathologization of motherhood, it speaks to this piece about what society tells us motherhood is and what mother should be like and how our experience of it should be. And a lot of, in my experience, and certainly in a lot of the women that I support, a lot of our experiences have been that we celebrate the highs, we acknowledge the beautiful parts, the cards, the buggies, the clothes. The focus has been very much on the light side of it, the positive side of it, and the darker side of it, or the other side of it, where we talk about the loneliness, the grief, the rage, the pain, physical and emotional and spiritual. Because within this massive shift in identity, I don't ever really remember being told that your transition into motherhood is going to make you question everything that you ever thought you knew about yourself. We're talking like dark night of the soul stuff, where all of the things that you identified with, you may no longer identify with them. And I think that side of motherhood has become so taboo. And I think we are doing a massive disservice to mothers everywhere by not offering the information that motherhood may bring you to the lowest of the lows that you have ever experienced. And that's not to say that you're broken or that there's something wrong with you. But how do we adjust someone's expectations of motherhood so that the reality of it doesn't seem so terrifying when they get there?
Yeah, absolutely. I heard you on, I think it's Laura Hand's podcast about mum guilt as a result of these kind of societal narratives that we have. So I would love to go a little bit deeper into what you see as the societal narratives alongside this pathologization of motherhood.
So the thing about mum guilt is it took me a long time to be able to actually just say with absolute confidence, mum guilt is a lie. Like it is a weapon of oppression that society has in many ways. But we cannot discuss motherhood honestly unless we are acknowledging, like, where do your beliefs of motherhood come from? Why do you believe the things that you do about motherhood? Speak to me of what you understand a good mother looks like and acts like. We will inevitably end up, of course, at a point of, well, these are the conversations that I was privy to as a child, the adverts that I saw, the movies that I watched, the magazines that were issued. You know, the women who came before me in my own family, my mother, my grandmother, my great-grandmother, my aunts, I've witnessed all of how they acted as mothers. So, okay, now we begin to see the role that society has in shaping us. Even, you know, we've been deeply disciplined into believing a certain behavior equals a good mother. And very often that behavior requires self-sacrifice, selflessness. So mothers will and should be, you know, we are kind of almost expected to be the main caregivers of the child without any resentment, happily giving up paid work outside the home, even if it's a career that we may have studied for a long time. Some mothers will happily do that and other mothers won't. So this is not in any way a judgment on the individual mothers. This is just talking about, I suppose, the overarching flavour of the conditions that we've all grown up in and the ideals that we've been led to believe are possible. But when we consider what are the main things that mothers feel guilty about, usually it's the idea of wanting time away from the child or the children. It's the boredom that they might feel raising a child, because, you know, it's supposed to be completely fulfilling for us. They feel guilty about perhaps not cooking organic homemade food from scratch. Mums feel guilty about using childcare if they have to or want to go back to paid work outside the home and they are utilising, you know, childminding or creches, all these types of things. There's guilt there. Mums feel guilty for letting themselves go, not looking like they thought they should, not getting their figure back as quickly as they thought they would. So when we consider, those are some of the first ones that come to mind. Of course, they go much deeper than that as well. Mums feel guilty for not playing with their children all the time. So where do all of those ideals come from? Who said that a mother shouldn't want to work outside the home for money if she should so desire? Who said that the mother has to be the main caregiver without any type of resentment? Who said good mothers don't want time away from their children for a couple of hours a night, a weekend? And people might say, well, that doesn't really happen anymore. But all you have to do is look at the magazines and the tabloids and the newspapers to see celebrity mothers being absolutely slated for having time away. I think one of the most recent ones was Lily Allen talking about having children destroyed her career opportunities.
Yeah.
And the backlash that she received because good mums don't have those conversations. So I think when we consider all of that and we look at, okay, so who benefits from us feeling guilty? So I believe that unless we address and we challenge the things that mothers feel guilty about, then we will continue to not prioritise ourselves. We'll continue to look after the needs of everybody else. We'll continue to be applauded for our self-sacrifice and our selflessness, whilst also not being supported to get out of it or to do things for ourselves. Like, why should we wait until we are on our knees to be given permission to have time for ourselves? So I question all of it, and I don't accept it.
And something I heard you just say there is around the kind of silence and secrecy that so much of this conversation is surrounded by. You know, and what we're speaking to there is shame, that actually a lot of women are feeling this, but it's perhaps not the narrative that they see online. It's not the narrative that's being held in, you know, conversations with other women. And can you speak a little bit to the shame that you might have experienced yourself, that you've experienced in conversation with other mothers, and that other women listening to this might be experiencing?
Absolutely. So, I mean, the whole idea when you consider shame is it's not just I'm doing bad things or I'm doing things I don't like, it's I'm a bad person. I'm a bad mum. Prior to having my son, I imagined and dreamt about what it would be like to breastfeed. And when my son came along, it was absolutely horrific. And at 6 weeks old, my son was hospitalised to establish feeding because he was so underweight and we hadn't picked up on this. And the guilt and the horror that I felt, here was me, a mother, with all these famed instincts that I'm supposed to have had, and yet I hadn't noticed that my son wasn't thriving. And in fact, at his 6-week check, now has to be hospitalised to establish feeding. And it turns out my son had a very severe lip and tongue tie, and he wasn't able to latch onto the breast properly. So when I thought he was full, he was actually just exhausted because he was having to work so hard for the little that he had. When I tell you that I was riddled with shame and guilt and absolute devastation, that I, as his mother, not even in the first 2 months of his life, hadn't picked up on this. And I remember we stayed in the hospital for 5 nights, and he immediately was put on formula, and I pumped and we measured. He had to be bottle fed constantly in the hospital in order to be able to measure the food that was going in. And I remember one of the sisters in the ward, the nurses, she sat beside me. She was saying, "This is not your fault. This is not your fault." And she just kept repeating it and repeating it. And I tell you, I get emotional now even thinking about it. When I tell you I sat beside her and wept, how had I ended up here? And I'll never forget her or her acts of kindness and reassurance because it wasn't my fault. And when my son and I were discharged from the hospital and he was thriving, he was gaining weight, and the hold that what I thought I should have been doing, it was so strong. And the grip that it had on me, it fed the shame, because the stronger the hold was, the more I believed I had failed, I had done it wrong. So therefore, the more shame I felt, and I couldn't speak it. I felt like the words were so painful and so stuck in me that I couldn't talk about how ashamed I was because I was so hurt. And as we know, the very things that feel like that are the very things that we have to speak, and as difficult as though they may be. So I started speaking about it. Closed my eyes almost and wanted to talk about it because I couldn't face being seen. And I spoke about it with my husband, I spoke about it with friends. And of course, whenever you find yourself speaking about something that feels so painfully shameful, you'll find that it touches something in someone else and they too may feel safe to share. And so these conversations began to unfold where mothers began, this is not long after that, I probably started writing about my motherhood experience. And all these other mothers started to contact me about their own versions of shame, what felt so painful for them. And so this silence that shrouds us all, that we are encouraged to stay in, because good mothers don't feel these things. Good mothers don't feel shame at their age. Good mothers don't question their decision, should I have become a mother? Good mothers don't go away for a weekend happily and not look back, knowing full well their children are being looked after. So the more I feel that we challenge and peel back this cloak of silence, the more we're able to address the shame. And when you address the shame, those mothers don't ever go back to wearing that shroud of silence, because they now know, like, who benefits from this? Because it's certainly not the mothers and it's certainly not the families. It's again going back to that big, elusive society, but the employers benefit from it, like even our own partners benefit from our silence and our shame, because they still get to continue on with their day-to-day lives without fully understanding the impact that our sacrifice has on us, because we don't talk about it, because good mothers don't complain about their self-sacrifice. They just go on with it.
Yeah, totally. And something was just coming into my brain whilst you were speaking about shame. I've heard a quote from Brené Brown that was really coming up for me, was the way to kill shame would be to put it in a Petri dish and just whisper "me too" to it, which I really love, because, I really see this wall of silence and shame around, motherhood. And, listen, I'm not a mother, but just what I see online of, what you're kind of talking to, of like the highlight reel of motherhood, and not the kind of complexity alongside all of that I'm sure all women experience in some way, shape or form. And actually having that normalized for so many women would be totally transformational. It's kind of come up a few times that you kind of started to speak to this, that there is this narrative, and I've heard you speak around this also, that narrative within our societal norms that, you know, motherhood, it's very kind of gendered and it's very child focused.
Yes.
And a lot of what you speak to is actually the role of the mother as, you know, as a self, as an individualized person within that. Can you speak a little bit to, you know, how society sees just the kind of the child-centric aspect, and how you see the development of the mother as self, individualized, and your own journey perhaps within that?
Absolutely. So my understanding of that comes from the work of a woman called Sharon Hayes, who talked about the intensive mothering ideology. Now, all of the people who I mention here, they don't stand in isolation, because these women, the work of Sharon Hayes is also reflective of the work of Adrienne Rich, Andrea O'Reilly, Sarah Roddick, and they all talk about things like maternal thinking, matricentric feminism. These are all women who have studied, they're feminist scholars, they're motherhood scholars. And so the conversations that we are able to have today all comes from the fact that, you know, we're standing on the shoulders of these women. If I remember correctly, the idea that I touched on a little bit earlier, where it is very much child-centered, so the child takes priority over everything, but it's the mother who should be ultimately serving the needs. She is the best person to serve the needs of the child. And sometimes it's also this idea, and many women internalize it, is that if it's not me that serves the needs of the child, then we run the risk of damaging the child. So this whole attachment stuff as well, it's all in there. And it's the idea that it's very expensive. So it's like you should trust your instincts, and at the same time, we should be employing experts to come in and advise us on things like sleeping, toilet training, milestone development. So it's very, we feel is the idea that our children's schedules and timetables, they are filled with activities because we want them to excel as human beings. And again, when we consider that's fine, but how much does it cost? Who is the one that is taking them from activity to activity? Who is the one? And as a stay-at-home mother, I'll tell you straight away who is the one that, generally speaking, will be the person to do all those things. It's me. It's the mum. Now, again, that's a big generalization, and I understand that may not be the case for everyone. But when we consider then, if we hold that as the ideal, and then we consider, well, what about the single parent families? What about the parents who can't afford for their children to go into 17 different activities a week? What about the mother who doesn't have access to support, and she is the one that's trying to do it all, or the father, whatever, or whoever the caregiver is? Does that mean then that they're not doing as good a job as those who can fully commit to this ideology of intensive mothering? And again, that's where we start to see the mum guilt coming in, the shame coming in, etc., etc.
Yeah. A question that was coming through for me also was what you would say to a mother who is experiencing, and I know that the annihilation of identity is continual throughout the process of motherhood, but a mother who is perhaps grappling with desire for self.
Yes.
What would you want to say?
Right. This is a subject that's very alive for me at the moment. So almost 11 years. I would have talked about my sense of self was completely hijacked by having children. And I couldn't figure out, but how does my trajectory as an individual, how do I move through the world and through my life now, questioning who am I? Because who am I is always going to be wrapped up in who they are. And I can't understand, how does my individuation process, how does my self-actualization, you know, if we were to talk about it in terms like this, how can I possibly even consider that without considering the impact that my son and my daughter have had on my sense of self? So this is like the stuff that goes through my mind in like 2 o'clock in the morning, and then when my husband wakes up, I'm like, who am I? So it's been a very long process to get to where I'm at now. So this new flavor that's come in, it speaks to another missing piece that I've had. This book, it's called Mother Self, right? I have had this book on my shelf, I'd say, since about 2017. So I've had it that long, and I tried reading it years ago and I was like, it's too much. And I was drawn to it again recently. It talks about it being a binary unity. And to me, that makes perfect sense, because my sense of self, who I will go on to become, will always be inextricably linked to Fionn and Molly. And I have wrestled with that because I believed that I had been hijacked. My sense of self had been hijacked by them. But in actual fact, it's so enmeshed with them and who they will become that it gives me great relief to have come across this work and to help me understand my own confusion around why has it been so difficult for me to accept that I as I no longer exist, but I'm still me. So it's so layered and it's so beautifully complex. And this new edition of understanding about my mother self is helping me in ways that I had never imagined, because I didn't know such a thing, such a language existed.
Would you want to, at some point, you mentioned earlier on in the conversation around normalizing these themes with other mothers, but around normalizing it, with our own mothers and with our own daughters, with our own sons. Can you see yourself at any point discussing with your children the complexity of parenthood?
Already.
Oh,
yes.
Amazing. How are you, because your children are 9 and 10, how are you discussing it with them at this point?
See, they have only ever known me as their mother, and they know I set up our Brave Hearts in the end of 2017. So from 2018, say. So my son would have been coming up for 5, my daughter 3. And they know that I work with mothers who feel lonely. How I explain it to them is like I work with moms who love their children so much, but they can't understand why parts of it being a mom are so difficult and so hard for them. But it's not the parts about the children. It's the parts that other people think being a mom is like. So I've always kind of spoken about it. My son can't play football for 8 weeks because he broke his collarbone. He has an identity crisis. And we talk about, it's so difficult for you to not be going out playing sport because your friends are out there and you're feeling lonely and things have changed. So when I contextualize it for him, who will be 11 this year, and then we talk about motherhood in the same way. Like, I had a job, I used to go into Dublin every day, I'd go shopping, and then when I had kids, I couldn't really do that anymore, and that was okay. I loved being with you, but it was hard for me to not have that either. So I believe that in actual fact, it breaks the cycle with our children when they begin to see their mother as a human being and not this self-sacrificing machine who has no dreams and no hopes.
Yeah. How did your son or, your daughter too, how have they received that? And how do you feel like it's impacted your connection with them?
I suppose I don't know any different.
Yeah.
I feel like it's impacted possibly when they're older. What they may have a different understanding of it when they truly begin to understand. Like they know I go for therapy because again, I'm studying becoming a therapist. So they know that for me, as part of my own studies, I have to go for weekly one-to-one personal therapy. I also have group therapy. They know I run groups of mums. So they understand that when I go there, I talk about all my feelings and I talk about, and particularly with my own children, a big part of it has been, this anger and rage that I have felt as a mother and how it has presented itself in the relationship that I have with my children and how I go to repair that. Because when I was a child, I don't really remember there being much repair. We just moved on. We didn't talk about it. Or that as children, as a child, I knew when things were being unsaid. I knew I could feel it. And that left me feeling quite unsafe because I was never able to actually name the thing. Whereas with my own children, I worked very hard to acknowledge that I was angry and, maybe I shouted or I spoke in a tone that I know they don't like, and I'm sorry for that. And I talk about why that maybe happened, and we sit there. So, like, for me, a big part of my own motherhood has been trying to break cycles of silence and shame. Again, goes back to those big, those big beasts that are constantly with us and how we deal with them. And I think I teach my children that as their mother, they are the loves of my life, and so am I one of the loves of my life. And I have dreams, and they're included in them too. And when we talk about all their hopes and dreams for the future, I talk about mine too.
I wanted to ask you how you feel motherhood has impacted your activism, especially in regards to what we've witnessed over the past 10 months.
So it's interesting, the word activism, because I would have used it myself, and then I hear other people talking in ways like, you know, is it activism or is it humanism? Like and I like that, because I'm like, I don't like, as someone who runs an online page, who runs a business from that page, and it's a motherhood page, I had no illusions about what would happen to that page when I started speaking up publicly against what was happening to the people of Palestine, in particular, the mothers and the children. So I think it was probably mid-October before I first posted, and I remember actually having a conversation with my husband, because, you know, I was very aware that there will be consequences, and I feel devastated that there are any type of consequences, but I was no fool. I knew that there would be, so I spoke to my husband about it. Like, this is something that I cannot ignore. Like, I have to make it very clear. And again, it was a very personal decision, but I don't want anybody to be under any illusion, should they stumble upon my Instagram page, of where I stand on this. I wanted to be so clear. And my husband says, well, you created this page, so you decide where you go with it. Like, I fully support you in this, and let's see where the chips fall. And the worry over the decision was actually, like, the decision itself was very easy, and it has been very easy since then. It was more the thought of it and the fear of what I imagined I would lose, and the people that I would lose contact with, and the business opportunities that I would lose, etc. I entertained that too long, instead of going with what my heart knew to be true for me. And when that decision was made and I acted on it, I haven't looked back since, because I cannot, and I imagine will never understand, the silence of anyone, but in particular, people and businesses that say that their work is in service of mothers. I cannot. Where are you? Where are your voices right now? Because I think the particular piece about the online platform is, and it goes back to what we spoke about earlier in regards to the polarization and the comment sections becoming minefields, about, you don't know what I'm doing offline. How dare you try and shame me for my lack of engagement online? And my response to that has been, I'm not trying to shame you. If you feel shamed, then that's something for you to consider. We live in the digital age. There is no hiding or getting away from the fact that our online footprint is huge, and also the access that we have to people. And I believe that regardless of the size of the page that you have, if you dare to say that you are running a community, or you're part of a community, you serve your community online, but you're not creating opportunities for discussion with your community, as has been said, then I believe that's morally wrong. And I question the community that has been built, because it clearly has been built on white supremacy, white privilege, and silence. Like, if we can't speak about subjects like this with our communities, then what kind of community is that? I don't know.
I'm interested how you see the wellness industry differently to perhaps how you did before.
Well, I suppose I would have to separate, like, what I would see is the full wellness industry, because how can any principle of wellness be built on the exclusion of demographics of people? That's not wellness. That's not wellness. That's selective privilege. That's, I'm going to sell things and talk about things that are relatively safe. They're not uncomfortable for the people who are part of this community to receive. And therefore, I will continue to be successful if we're going to measure it in metrics, like in regards to reach, visibility, etc. So I don't believe that's wellness. I believe that for a long time that we were all duped into thinking that. I think now what I'm realizing, and I'm glad of this, is that I divesting from these circles of predominantly, in my own experience has been, I'm based here in Ireland, predominantly white country. There's certainly, when I consider the circles that I have moved in and that I have wanted to be in, when I consider who's not been part of those conversations, who's not been in the room, like I cringe how willfully ignorant I have been. And it's at this point, I think, that people will message me privately to say that they're at, but they continue to do nothing about. So my issue with this wellness industry, therapists, coaches, gurus, spiritual practitioners, women's circles holders, doulas, midwives, all of these people, if I don't see any capacity whatsoever for a person to be able to engage in conversation at this level, then I don't trust that provider to be able to hold that space in person either. Because I don't think in this day and age we can separate them both. I don't believe that you can have a public business page that says nothing. And when people say, but I'm saying nothing because I know that the people who are coming to this page are coming for education and community. And I'm like, but what are you educating them on, and what community are you building if you're not having this opportunity to discuss with them? Because they're coming to that particular page, they're going to a person for a reason, and it's usually because you've established trust at this point. The person who's coming to your page for education and community trusts you. So is it not then an abuse of trust to not talk about this? I can't, and I won't accept the silence of many practitioners.
Yeah, absolutely. And something that I've heard you speak to is this notion of shift work.
Yeah.
Because
oh, yes.
I know that's come up for a lot of people that I know, and myself included, of, consuming a lot of what we've seen on our screens over the last 10 months, but also having the demands of our lives on top of that and hitting these points where we deeply want to keep going and keep caring and keep sharing, keep showing up, but feeling some level of kind of depletion, but then the guilt and the shame that then comes in of that. And something that I've seen you speak to is this notion of shift work within our humanism. So could you just speak to that?
Of course. That was actually, I spoke about this before, and I acknowledged that I read that in a comment section of a post. It was on, and when you're in the online world, people's like Instagram pages. So it's mixing up motherhood.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Yes. And it was in the comment section of one of her posts, I think, like back in November, when I was reading, because I didn't come across that page until after October, when I started to see practitioners and people within the motherhood space speaking up about what was happening. And so I deeply resonated with all that she spoke about, and still do to this day. But in the comment sections of one of her posts, there was this chain of comments, and somebody said, ultimately, because I think they were addressing burnout and overwhelm and, that freeze response that was kicking in as a result of everything that was unfolding. So therefore I can do nothing and I feel such guilt and shame about it. And the person commenting was saying, well, consider it like shift work. Now I'm paraphrasing because I can't remember now exactly what was said, but it's this idea of just like every type of shift, like in a company, in an organization where people clock in, they do the work and they clock off as others are clocking in. So we have this rotation. The work is always being done, but people go home, they clock off, they rest, they feed, and then they come back on. And the person that was talking about it was applying it to, long-term activism work, because for many of us who were relatively new to it, the sense of urgency, I have to do all the things, talk about all the things, share all the posts all the time. And immediately, within a very short space of time, we are burnt out and heartbroken and can't function. Whereas the idea to consider that I clock on, knowing that somewhere in the world, someone's clocking off right now, and soon it will be my time to clock off again. And I just thought that was a beautiful way to try and help myself reframe my role here.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. And it's such a great insight for people that have been struggling within the area of how we regulate ourselves at this
Yes.
time and how we can show up. So I love that. Thank you for sharing that. And thank you to the person who shared it in the first
Yeah,
place.
yeah, I
We
know,
see
I
you.
know.
And just speaking to my own experience, of the last 10 months, and I discussed this with Lucy the other day, I feel like I constantly cycle between a whole range of emotions, the horror of what we're seeing, the anger that then shows up of this collective apathy towards that, my own then shifting into gratitude for what I have, the privileges that I get to experience, the guilt and the shame of my privilege within that, but then not wanting to squander everything that I do get to experience, so wanting to lean into the joy and then cycling back around again. It's almost like this kind of like 24-hour roller coaster of all of it happening all at the same time. And I'm curious how, with everything that we've witnessed within Palestine over the last 10 months, how does that show up in connection with you, with your kids, being a mother? Do you kind of yeah, I guess with me having just shared what happens for me, what happens for you within motherhood, perhaps with your kids bearing a witness to what we see?
My kids, I would be so in my local area here, I wanted to do like I needed to do something outside of the big national process that happen like once a month here, although there are other things happening. So locally on a bridge here in my town, I go down every Friday morning from 7:30 till 8:30 with my Palestine flags. And I've been doing this now for about 3 months, I think. And people come and join me and we wave our flags. And anyway, so now in my kitchen, I have my flags and the kids are like that. Those are mom's flags. So they've come down a few times as well with my husband to stand on the bridge and then wave the flags. So they understand the significance in many aspects of what's happening through the lens of they know they're as a family. When there is a march on, they'll either come with me or the priority is I get to go in or the bridge. So they understand the significance without fully understanding what's actually happening, because obviously we speak about it in a very age appropriate way in regards to the occupation, and as well here in Ireland, the historical situation is as well, like the children understand a little bit about the history of Ireland and also occupation, colonial powers. So when we talk a little bit about it in reference to Palestine, they get it a little bit. But how it has affected me in motherhood is that there are moments of absolute joy when I witness them blowing bubbles or climbing. And like what you were saying, that cycle of, and usually in those moments when I consider what's happening elsewhere in the world right now and why it's being allowed to happen, why people are speaking up more about it, the joy and the awe and the love is what transmutes into mother rage, like absolute rage against the machine that has to be channeled and it has to be directed somewhere, because if not, it would destroy us from the inside out. And I think that is what leads to the intensity of the writing. It leads to the absolute certainty that there is no grey area here, not in a genocide. There cannot be. There is no grey area. And so for me, that's very clear. And right now, and maybe in years to come, when I look back on what I have written recently and how I stand and how I speak now, perhaps there may be regrets about how I worded things, but there will be no regrets about where I stand. And I feel that's very important for me and for my children. I want them to see that we have to take a stand sometimes. We absolutely have to. And we have to just suffer the consequences. Let it be. What happens is, like, whatever happens as a result of that, trust that there will be people around you who stand with you. And I think that's what I hope they see from this.
What would you love to see within motherhood, within humanism, and how would you love everyone to be a part of that?
What I would love to see is what I'm bringing, because I'm trying to be, that like be the change that you want to see in the world. So I'm so, my own understanding of what I offer, how I offer it, the people that I can help is changing and has changed over the last while. So what I want to see is access for all mothers who want it to be able to get it. Like, I think we, particularly as people who work in the motherhood sphere or in that arena, there is this idea of, you know, the more expensive your services, the better you are. And perhaps many years ago, Megan, I would have bought into that idea that this, you have to be so expensive because that's what tells people you're good at what you do. And I believed it, and I probably aimed at that for a while. That was my motivation, was to charge as much as I possibly could and be so exclusive. And now, like, I cringe a little bit in the inside at how much I really fell for that. As opposed to now, what I would love to see is more and more mothers being offered seats at the table so that we can all sit down together and we can make it accessible and we can begin to lead with community care. And we can, as a result of that, then each of us can take off our own cloaks of silence so that we can show our shame. Because the ripple effect of that in our families and behind our closed doors, and therefore in our children's adult lives as well, like that can't be measured by euro, pounds, or how much it costs to work with somebody an hour. Like all of that, like let it burn, and let everybody who wants access to conversation and support have it.
Amazing. Well, I'm so grateful and thankful that you are in this space doing what you do, Jacqueline. So thank you so much for your time today, Jacqueline. It's been amazing to share space with you. So yeah, big thank you.
Oh, thanks, Megan. I loved it. Thank you for inviting me on.
So what do we think?
Well, I mean, obviously I know Jacqueline already and I know her work. I loved it. It was particularly interesting hearing the questions that you asked, which weren't solely around your personal experience, because obviously you aren't a mother, which kind of added like a real depth. And my favorite part was when Jacqueline was talking about how motherhood has shaped her activism, which she calls humanism, which great.
Yes.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. And yeah, I just loved hearing that, because that's something that we have talked about kind of offline a lot, is the people that remain silent, and particularly the people in wellness and for me in kind of motherhood who make money supporting mothers. But Jacqueline had kind of extrapolated it out to be talking about people who build communities and say that part of, you know, their role is to build communities. Well, how can you say that if you're not creating a safe space for people within that community to talk about Palestine? I found that fascinating.
Yeah.
What did you think?
Totally. And I think, you know, the 2 points that you just raised there, firstly, when she challenged my use of the word activism to replace it with humanism, that was so powerful for me, because of course it's humanism. Like, of course it's human to care about basic lack of safety and, you know, mind-boggling and horrifying things that we're witnessing. That's not activism. It's not activism to care about that. You know, it's a human thing. And that for me was an amazing challenge. And I've been saying it like ever since. So like, thank you to Jacqueline for that. I think throughout the episodes that I've been doing over the last couple of months, it just becomes clear more and more how powerful the language that we use is. And actually, when we say activism, it makes it sound like it is like something that's kind of separate from just our humanity. And so really replacing that with the use of the word humanism was just really, it should be obvious, but it was really powerful for me. So I loved that. And I love the conversation that came off of that. And it's so interesting, actually, what you just said in terms of you felt that me not being a mother added depth to the conversation, because I suppose that I was conscious, you know, having a conversation about motherhood as someone who's not a mother, you know, for me, that was like, does it add depth or does it not add depth? But it's amazing to hear kind of that actually you felt like it did. And, you know, I'm pleased about that, because I would love this conversation and these types of conversations to be accessible to people who are not mothers, whether that is by choice, whether that is by, you know, not choice. But I think, you know, for me, it was beautiful to be in that conversation, to recognize how I can also support friends of mine who are mothers with this type of topic, and also just support motherhood as a concept and as a, you know, as an entity within itself. How can I show up better for motherhood as someone who is not a mother? So I'm really pleased. How did you feel like it added depth, me not being a mother, within the conversation? I'm curious.
Well, I think so. When I used to work, a company that I used to work for, who shall not be named because we should all be boycotting them, we used to say this thing when we were kind of discussing products and things, and we would say, are we speaking to ourselves? And what that kind of meant was, are we, as people who work for the company, just literally talking to ourselves and forgetting the people that buy the product? And the other thing, which you just spoke to, was how can we all, as a collective, see motherhood as just not just the task of the parent, which typically will be the woman in a heteronormative kind of relationship.
Yeah.
How can we see it as this is all of our children?
Kind of what I hear within that is, you know, I know what you mean about the, like, you just speaking to each other. And I guess that can happen easily within like the wellness world or like the coaching world or something like that. You kind of, because it's stuff that is so second nature to you now, you almost forget what it's like to not be within that conversation all of the time. And I guess that's kind of what I'm hearing from you, of like, if it's two mothers, there are things that perhaps you might know that you take it for granted that other women might know, but me, not as a mum, might ask things in a different kind of way, or just have a complete lack of knowledge within this area because I do, because I haven't experienced it. So so I'm really pleased that added something to the conversation. I love that.
Also, you don't have a complete lack of knowledge. I think there's also this idea that if you're not a mother, that you don't get to have a seat at the table and talk about motherhood. And I don't think that's true. And I think it really discounts. I think we do ourselves a disservice if we just say we're the only ones that are allowed to have an opinion about things.
I think that speaks to, you know, what we've also spoken about offline outside of the episodes, is like this diversity of thought, like really wanting that to come through within my podcast, and how that adds so much richness, as opposed to everyone who's got similar backgrounds, similar thoughts, just having a conversation that is a conversation within itself.
What's next?
Next up, we have Natasha, who is going to be speaking about activism/humanism. She is a photographer, and activism has really just been so foundational throughout her life that it's so second nature to her. And I was so interested in, you know, the work that she does, the role that it plays, not being this like separate entity within her life, but very much interwoven into all facets of her life. And how, you know, the work that she does with refugees, she runs a refugee organization here within Brighton. So just really an exploration into, the work that she does, and how we can all bring a little bit more humanism into our life.
Thank you for listening. It's great to have you with me on this journey towards higher love for all. Our time is our greatest commodity and gift, so thanks for investing it in yourself and sharing it with me. Please do take a moment to rate and review the show, all of which enables more people to find me and for me to connect with more great guests each week for both yours and my enjoyment. All links, references, and contact information is detailed too within the show notes. And I always love to hear your feedback, so feel free to hit me up on my Instagram at higherlove_with_Megan, or via my website, higher-love.com. Send your takeaways, and if you enjoyed this episode, please share or send on to someone else who would benefit. Until next time, big love.